Good evening. My name is Joseph Sipocz. I'm here for the St. Joseph County Public Library, and it's time for another Saturday night story. And tonight, hold on. Oh no. Okay, needed some fortification. Our text for tonight is called "Calling BS," and it is written by Carl T. Bergstrom and Jevin D. West. I will be reading from the last chapter and the last part of the last chapter. Okay, the last chapter is called "Refuting BS." And the last bit of that chapter is called The Psychology of Debunking, which I feel like it offers a little bit of news we can use. So it starts with some general advice. Keep it simple, take it offline, find common ground, don't overemphasize the myth. Fill in knowledge gaps with alternative explanations. All good. There's some pointers. Good. But before we conclude here, we would like to have a few thoughts about how to do so in an ethical and constructive manner. So, be correct, be charitable, admit fault, be clear, and be pertinent. And that's the part I'm going to read tonight. Okay. When we teach our students to call BS, we want to avoid creating a legion of well, actually guys. What's a well, actually guy? It's the guy who interrupts a conversation to demonstrate his own cleverness by pointing out some irrelevant factoid that renders the speaker incorrect on a technicality. Let's take an example. I'm talking to a friend of mine over lunch and I say, "It's interesting. There are lots of birds that trick other species into raising their offspring. Cuckoos, cowbirds, honey glides, and even some ducks. But mammals never do this. I wonder why not." She thinks for a moment and observes, "I suspect it's because mammals don't lay eggs. That makes it a lot harder to sneak a baby in there." "Well, actually," I respond, "some mammals do lay eggs, echidna and platypuses." Let's face it, that was a totally annoying thing to do, and it had nothing to do with calling BS. Why not? Let's look at some of the factors that distinguish a caller of BS from a well, actually guy. Relevance. When you do a good job of calling BS, you undermine a claim in a fundamental way. Your objections negate the argument a speaker is trying to make. A well, actually guy doesn't move the discussion forward at all. Instead, he offers a pedantic or tangential objection that does not have much bearing on the core claims. When I objected about the mammals and eggs, I was not wrong, but my objection was almost entirely immaterial to the conversation we were having. There are a few egg-laying mammals, but my friend was right about 99.9% of mammal species. In the end, my friend's statement, "mammals don't lay eggs," while isn't usually universally true, it's basically right. Speaker's intention. Typically, a caller of BS refutes someone who is intentionally BSing or being deceptive. A well, actually guy is different. He doesn't hesitate to contradict someone who is engaging in a dialogue of good faith. When I griped about mammals, I fell on the wrong side of this line. My friend's suggestion was made in good faith. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to mislead anyone. She was simply trying to help me by answering my question. Objectors' motivations. A well, actually guy doesn't care much about the argument he is going, how it's going, as he does about demonstrating his own intellectual superiority. I didn't mention the mammals because they had any bearing on my friend's idea. I brought them up in order to make it clear that I'm better versed in mammals and in matters zoological than she is, and possibly for the opportunity to use the word oviparous in conversation. Calling BS is not a way to signal your intelligence. Get a Mensa card if that's your sort of thing that's important to you. Audience. When you call BS, you are usually trying to prevent a BSer or liar from misleading an audience. A well, actually guy doesn't care about protecting an audience. He is merely interested in demonstrating his own cleverness. When I objected about the mammals, no one else was even part of that conversation. Power dynamics. When you call BS, you may find yourself speaking truth to power. Well, actually, guys don't speak truth to power. He's often punching down. His motivation is to put the speaker in her place while raising himself up. Judiciousness. A caller of BS makes a careful decision about whether it is worthwhile to speak up, derail a conversation, risk a confrontation, and make someone feel defensive. A well actually guy simply can't help himself. He hears something he believes he can contradict, and he doesn't have the self control to think about whether that is helpful to do so. In the end, the well actually guy has more in common with the BSer than he does with the caller of BS. The BSer disregards truth or logical coherence in order to impress or overwhelm an audience. That's the well actually guy. He doesn't care about advancing truth or about the logical coherence of his objections. He is simply trying to impress or intimidate someone with his knowledge. Calling BS is not about making yourself feel smarter. If that's your goal, you are missing the point of this chapter. Spotting BS is not easy, especially with the daily onslaught of misinformation. It takes deliberate and practice and effort. Remember, calling BS is more than a claim. It's a powerful action and can be easily misused. But if you make an effort to be clear and correct and to remain reasonably civil, people will respect you. Before you publicly refute a claim, ask yourself who is your audience and whether the audience is worth your time. Some people are so immersed in their beliefs that they will never be convinced, no matter how cogent or the argument that you, or how airtight the facts. Spend your time and effort on people who are willing to engage. Above all, remember Neil Postman's dictum: at any given time, the chief source of BS with which you may have to contend is yourself. Confirmation bias can make us more confident than we ought to be, and humility is an important corrective. Self-reflection and an appreciation for the difficulty of getting to truth, these are the marks of a mature thinker worth trusting. Sure, we want to keep the rest of the world honest, but for everyone's sake, let's start with ourselves. Calling BS is more than a party trick, confidence booster, or a way to sound impressive in front of your boss. It is a moral imperative. As we note at the beginning line of this book, the world is awash in BS, from clickbait to deepfakes. None of it is innocuous. Some of it isn't innocuous, some of it a minor annoyance, and some of it even funny. But a lot of the BS out there has serious consequences for human health and prosperity, the integrity of science, and democratic decision making. The rise of misinformation and disinformation keeps us up at night. No law or fancy new AI is going to solve this problem. We all have to be a little more vigilant, a little more thoughtful, a little more careful when sharing information. And every once in a while, we need to call BS when we see it. There's news you can use indeed. Good night.